Afternoon, Jim. We are here in Belfast at Crescent on another fine spring day. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It is a beautiful day, I'm pleased to say.
It is lovely. And Jim, since we last recorded, another conflict has erupted in the Middle East, which has, I guess, brought to the surface again some of the issues that we've been discussing in this season.
Yes, it's a very worrying time, and the issues involved are so complicated that we can't really form a judgment at this stage, but I just hope that it doesn't lead to a global conflict.
Yeah, no, it is concerning to see the situation as it unfolds. And we're particularly praying for the Christians in Iran and across the Middle East, of which there are many. But Jim, we've reached our final episode of Season 11. I know this has been a season that you've had to follow a whole load of different people that you're now delighted to have unfollowed.
Yes, I spent an enjoyable 20 minutes this morning unfollowing a whole set of really quite unpleasant human beings.
So, yeah. So your ex timeline has had a bit of a cleanse, which I'm sure is a very healthy thing. But just to reflect on what we discussed last time, in our previous episode, you provided us with a critique of Christian nationalism. And we ended up particularly disagreeing with the Christian nationalist conception of a nation and its vision for society. But up to now, our listeners might have noticed that we haven't really offered any specific solutions of our own. And a Christian nationalist might argue that Christians who oppose their stance don't have any answers. That they might say, yeah, you can throw rocks at us and, point out all the flaws in what we believe, but at least we're trying to think about how to rescue Western society. How would you respond to their complaint?
By agreeing with them. It's not enough to just poke holes in the case for Christian nationalism, or to hide behind pious-sounding phrases that dress up a sort of sanctimonious defeatism. So in this episode, I have to serve up some sort of an alternative strategy, because I do think Christian nationalism is a deeply flawed idea. I think we need a better story. So anyway, I hope we can structure this conversation into 3 segments. First, I want to give a very brief summary of last week's critique of Christian nationalism, and then we'll set out what I hope is a better story for how Christians should try to rescue the West. And finally, we're going to link that story with a better story for men in the West.
We said at the start of this season that we're dealing with 2 intertwined crises, the crises over the West and the crisis over masculinity. And we've called this final episode Men of the West, because we'll finish up by trying to paint a picture of what a young Christian man should strive to become and strive to do in society in the midst of this civilization crisis.
So let's give a brief summary of our critique of Christian nationalism. Last week's episode was full of some difficult theology. I'm going to ignore all that for now and just extract the headline consequences that flow from the theology. Christian nationalism is a project designed to achieve political domination. I'm amazed at how often Christian nationalists squirm away from that statement. Just last week, Ali Beth Stuckey said that the term Christian nationalism is a derogatory term used to silence the conservative Christian voice. Professor Andrew Walker tweeted exactly the same thing a couple of days ago. But both Stuckey and Walker are being disingenuous. Christian nationalism is not simply the voice of Christian wisdom crying out in the public square. Christian nationalists are dominionists. They have a plan to build a Christian caliphate through the use of political muscle. The strategy I hope to set out in this episode centres on projecting the voice of conservative Christianity in the public square. And as we'll see, our approach requires more courage, because we can't hold on to the apron strings of an unbelieving overman. We'll just be speaking truth to power.
Okay, Jim, so could you help us pull out the sort of headlines, I guess, from your critique last week, particularly all the theology we discussed? What headlines could you pull out from that?
Well, I think we get 5 headlines. First, Christian nationalism embraces authoritarianism. It is self-consciously post-liberal. Whether it be the Theo-bros' dream of a Christian prince, the Catholic integralists' plan to build a coercive sacral state under the authority of Rome, or the Christian MAGA alliance support for Donald Trump. In all 3 cases, we see the same instinct toward authoritarianism. Now, I agree with Christian nationalists that Christianity is the major foundation on which the West was built. Even Locke's individualism stems ultimately from Christianity. But Christianity wasn't the only foundation. The concepts of republicanism come originally from ancient Greece and Rome. They re-emerged during the Renaissance in things like the Hanseatic League. But the main wellspring of republican ideals can be traced back to Oliver Cromwell's Christian Republic, what he called the Commonwealth of England. Now, that English experiment failed, as we know, but it was literally transported to the New World, and we see its ideals fully expressed in the Constitution of the United States. So just think about all that history, the hard-fought liberties that emerged from centuries of despotism. They gave us freedom of religion, freedom of speech. They gave us the checks and balances that restrain political power in a liberal democracy. I mentioned last week that one aspect of natural law theory is the accrual of wisdom in how to govern societies. And the freedoms I've just mentioned are the product of centuries of argument over how to govern in a fallen world. You won't find democratic principles sitting on the surface of Scripture. Humanity developed them under the terms of the Noahide Covenant. Now here's my point. Christian nationalists propose to throw away all those freedoms, centuries of accrued wisdom, jettison freedom of religion, freedom of speech, liberal democracy. That's why my first headline is that Christian nationalism embraces authoritarianism and discards hard-won liberties. The second headline is that Christian nationalism insists that everyone, whether they be atheist, Hindu or Muslim, must live as cultural Christians. Christians impose legislation on them for their own heavenly good. The coercive scheme ignores the Christian believer's creation mandate. The covenant with Noah, if you remember, obliges us to seek the good of everyone, to preserve order and peace for all citizens. We might not share the same beliefs about life's ultimate loves and goods, but we all share the same human nature, so we can work together to build an ordered and stable society. So my second headline, criticism, is that Christian nationalism ignores our creation mandate to preserve order for all citizens. If Hindus and Muslims come to our country legally, we should want them to live peaceful and ordered lives. We should want them to feel at home. And that's because Gentile nations are common things. They aren't meant to manifest in concrete form the kingdom of Christ.
Last week, you contrasted the sort of Christian caliphate envisaged by Christian nationalists with a civic society that supports what you called engaged pluralism. Just remind us of what you meant by that.
Well, that contrast explains my third headline criticism. Christian nationalism relies on the coercive power of the state rather than on truth and persuasion. I think I used the slightly weird term engaged pluralism last week to explain how the alternative to coercion might work. Now, I'm conscious that some listeners will flinch when they hear the word pluralism because they think of how the progressive left defines it today. They are moral relativists who say to religious types, go play your little rituals and enjoy your holy days if it makes you happy. Meanwhile, the grown-ups will operate society according to secular principles. Now, I mean the very opposite of that idea. Engaged pluralism is the opposite of what is sometimes called the neutral public square. Instead of banishing religious ideas from public life, engaged pluralism brings them all to the table. In other words, we create a society in which different faith groups can explore and challenge each other's beliefs, in a courteous and respectful way, of course. But Christian nationalists are fiercely opposed to that sort of engaged pluralism because they rely on the coercive power of the state rather than on truth and persuasion.
So we've thought about 3 of your 5 headline criticisms of Christian nationalism. It embraces authoritarianism. It insists that everyone must live as cultural Christians. It relies on the coercive power of the state rather than on truth and persuasion. Tell us about the final 2 headlines.
The final 2 points are best understood as gloomy predictions made by a scholar called James Davison Hunter. He makes the good point that authoritarianism, if you think about it, is a response to a lack of solidarity in society. In other words, if there are no common civic values, if there is no shared sense of the common good, then there is nothing to glue individuals together into a cohesive society. So authoritarianism will step into that vacuum and do the gluing through coercion. And I think he is spot on with that analysis. As I've just tried to argue, in the absence of engaged pluralism, there is no way to build common civic values. There can be no negotiated understanding of the common good. All you're left with is political power. So society collapses into this zero-sum game where each tribe exerts its will to power. Whatever noble ideals Christian nationalists might have will get swept away in a ruthless world like that. And so inevitably, Christians will start to align themselves with the dark power of ethno-nationalism. Now, that bleak outcome brings us to the final headline, and it's the one which most directly affects church pastors. Christian nationalism will fail as a political project, or at least Protestant Christian nationalism will fail. The rise of political Catholicism is a much more sinister affair, but that's the subject for our next season. But once Protestant Christian nationalism collapses into ethno-nationalism, an entire generation of young Christians will have had their faith shipwrecked. They followed the Theo Bros and the Christian MAGA influencers into an apocalyptic culture war. For a while it was really exciting, but like all religious idols, it turned to dust. Protestant nationalism dreamed of a Christian prince, but all it will have done is help usher in Nietzsche's Overman. We will have draped the robes of Christ around the Antichrist. And when that realization dawns, there will be nowhere to go but the nihilism of the manosphere. James Hunter says that Western society is already swirling around that plug hole. Even today, he says, if you look at either the right or the left, there is a common culture, and that is nihilism. In the end, only rage and despair are left.
And that's certainly a bleak vision, Jim. If Christian nationalism is not the answer, we do need a better story, don't we? What do you think that story is? Can you start to sort of maybe flesh that out a bit for us?
Okay, well, I'm going to lay out a strategy which has 3 strands. The titles of each strand might seem a bit like motherhood and apple pie, but I'd ask our listeners to reserve judgment until I've set out the more detailed policy proposals in each one. Now, I was thinking, I guess this thing needs a sort of overall title. And I eventually decided to pinch the title of a book called Hopeful Realism. Now, I don't agree with all the contents of that book, but I want to acknowledge my indebtedness to the authors for the title.
So your alternative to Christian nationalism is a 3-stranded plan called Hopeful Realism. So could you start by just laying that out for us, Jim?
Okay. Well, Hopeful Realism, as I'm calling it, and Christian nationalism share the same diagnosis of the crisis in the West. The rejection of God during the Enlightenment created what Os Guinness calls a cut flower culture. Flowers in a vase might look nice for a while, but they have been cut off from their roots, so eventually they will rot and die. The Enlightenment project came crashing down in the ash heaps of Auschwitz. And rather than repenting, the West embarked on this disastrous experiment known as the post-war consensus. They banished the strong gods of virtue, solidarity, family and truth, and welcomed in the weak gods of openness, diversity and inclusion. The result was an atomized society which had no shared sense of the common good. The concept of a nation was deliberately weakened, reduced to an administrative centre. Its borders were designed to be porous, because the Western elite wanted mass immigration to wash away their loathing of their own heritage. Now, unlike Christian nationalism, what I'm calling hopeful realism wants to restore and rebuild Western nations as civic nations. Rather than introducing this alien idea of a nation as a Christian caliphate, a holy nation that manifests in concrete form the kingdom of Christ, we return to the idea of a civic nation. A civic nation builds bonds between people of different faiths and no faith, using civic virtues like civility, fairness, neighbourliness, and reciprocity. A civic nation upholds freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It is bound by a shared understanding of the common good and a common commitment to the rule of law. Civic nations are common things, not holy. They exist to preserve order and support peaceful human flourishing. So the first of Hopeful Realism's 3 strands is this: restore a civic nation.
Could you give us a sense of the policies that might emerge within that strand?
Right, I propose 5 policy areas, and the first is to control a nation's borders. There is a real naivety among young progressives on this point. If we opened our borders completely, it would be in no one's interest, because the country would collapse under the strain. In the past 4 years, over 2.5 million immigrants have arrived in the UK. And as we discussed in episode 3, the Bible sees immigration as a normal and healthy process, provided that the host nation can handle the integration and assimilation challenges. Given the febrile state of the nation over this issue just now, I would suggest prudence demands that the rate of immigration be slowed down to a more manageable number. And then there is the challenge posed by illegal immigration. The authorities, I think, have actually done quite a good job of intercepting the boats coming over from France. But the legal system is so open to manipulation that deportation of illegals is not high. In 23-24, there were only about 4,000 enforced returns of illegal migrants. Wealthy left-wing donors like George Soros support NGOs and advocacy groups in the UK which oppose the deportation process. I don't want to seem overly harsh here, but I think Elon Musk is right to call out George Soros' Open Society Foundation as an evil force in the world. So the first policy proposal for border control is to cut back the tangle of progressive organisations that are gumming up our nation's legal system. A civic nation cannot be restored if it is prevented from controlling its borders. The second policy is to restore objective law. No one has the right not to be offended. So most of the hate speech laws should be swept away because they're based on subjective feelings. If a self-identified victim feels offended by a statement I make, then under current hate speech law, I could be guilty of a criminal offence. Now, hate speech laws are vague, subjective things, so they cannot be enforced consistently by the police. They cause the police, through no fault of their own, to become ideological bullies rather than law enforcers. The underlying concept that must be rooted out of law is the idea that words are a form of violence. Now, we need to distinguish between law and social repercussions. There should be social repercussions for saying something insulting, but law cannot make subjective judgments. Now, of course, the more narrowly focused legislation on incitement to violence should remain, but law should never be based on subjective feelings. My third policy proposal is to make a covenant together based on the common good. A nation is not a collection of individual consumers in a global marketplace. A nation has shared values, customs, and responsibilities. And because humans all share the same nature, we can agree on certain basic moral goods in society. Every human knows the truth of Psalm 34 verse 14, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. As we saw last time, Thomas Aquinas is linked most closely to this theory called natural law. The natural law is a set of stable, morally obligating norms grounded in our common nature. It produces moral goods like fairness, honesty, and respect for other people and their property. And Aquinas saw three departments of natural law: the sanctity of life, protection of family life, and the maintenance of social order. Now remember, these aren't specifically Christian laws. They're more like a covenant we voluntarily enter into because we share a common human nature. So there will be values that we consciously agree to outlaw. Things like abortion and euthanasia pervert the natural order about the sanctity of life. Transgenderism and homosexuality pervert the natural law about family life. The Apostle Paul makes that precise argument in Romans 1. These things are unnatural, he says.
The question that then is raised by some of the things you've said is how can we make a covenant together based on the common good when our society is so divided over issues like abortion and human sexuality, for example?
You've raised a glaringly obvious problem, Ollie. But allow me to park it for now, okay? Because you'll see by the time I'm finished that the hopeful realism strategy does address the point you've just raised. All I would say for now is that progress towards a covenant based on natural law is not impossible. So imagine you sit in a room with let's say a Muslim, a Hindu, a nominal Catholic, and a progressive liberal. So 5 people in the room. 4 of you would agree on issues like abortion and homosexuality. Only the progressive liberal would disagree. And when the topic of tolerance comes up, again 4 of you would agree that no one has the right to impose their worldview on anyone else. This time it would be the Muslim who would be in the minority of 1. And in both cases, the Christian would be in the majority group. Showing rational leadership like that, using arguments based on natural law, seems to me to be a much more effective strategy than trying to use political muscle to force the other 4 people in the room into becoming cultural Christians.
We're still thinking about this first strand of your hopeful realism strategy, restoring a civic nation. Tell us about your 4th policy suggestion then.
Okay, it is very simple. Encourage freedom. This is perhaps the main point of difference between hopeful realism and Christian nationalism. I argue that there is a lot of accrued wisdom about human government in the Western tradition. We still benefit from the hard-won freedoms of a liberal democracy. And Christian nationalists, as I said before, want to jettison things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. As post-liberals, they want to discard all the restraints we have on political power, the checks and balances, the separation of powers, in favour of authoritarian rule. Now, I understand their frustration, because at the moment all the institutions of the state have been hijacked by neo-Marxists who want to drive Christianity into the dustbin of history. But I don't think there are any shortcuts here. Christians just need to win a long, protracted battle in the realm of ideas. We need to argue that the separation of church and state does not mean that religious concepts cannot be discussed in the public square. The smartest, most anti-Christian strategy ever deployed is the so-called fact-value split. According to that theory, only scientific facts should be allowed into public discourse. Religious values should be banished to the badlands of conjecture and idle speculation. So I think this is our most urgent task, to reclaim our right to introduce the Christian worldview into public discourse. Why do progressives get to bring Freud and Gramsci and Foucault to the table, but we aren't allowed to bring Isaiah and the Apostle Paul? We need to crush the tyranny of the woke civil servants, the unthinking MPs who trot out the "oh, that's religious talk" defence against any critique of their schoolboy secularism. The final policy suggestion in this strand of restoring a civic nation is to build a home. To build a home together that respects our Christian heritage. We have made the point repeatedly that nations have temporal depth. They have a shared history with cultural narratives that make us feel at home. Nations aren't hotels. A nation is a kinship relation, so it should feel like home. And that applies to immigrants as well. An immigrant should never feel like a permanent guest. That is the problem with the country house model of a nation. That's the model assumed by Christian nationalism. But there is a better model. Jonathan Sacks wrote a brilliant little book on this subject. It's called The Home We Build Together. I think I mentioned it in episode 3. And the best chapter in the book is about the tabernacle of all things, described in the book of Exodus. And Sacks describes the challenge that Moses faced. How could he take a group of querulous, unhappy refugees and transform them into a united civic nation? God's genius plan, says Sacks, was to get them to work on a joint project, the construction of the tabernacle. Each person brought their own unique contribution. It was a thing that they all built together. And identity is something that is built together. Sacks then applies that model to nations like ours today. We should aim to build a civic nation together, he says. That's how we will achieve social cohesion. But for that project to work, there has to be a blueprint. There have to be some planning rules and some architectural drawings. And that point brings me to our nation's Christian heritage. We shouldn't expect immigrant communities to build stone cathedrals and stroll through village greens in their Sunday best while eating fish and chips. But we can expect them, while they build their communities, to follow some basic planning rules. Within those basic constraints, there is freedom to build a new feature of the nation's home. So let me give you a stupid example. I like the fact that chicken tikka masala is now a popular British dish. It's culturally enriching to eat the occasional late-night kebab rather than pie and mash. I've never actually eaten pie and mash, but you get the point. But the planning rules for the nation must be respected. Rules like the way we treat women, a common language, even if it's spoken with a broad Belfast accent, the fact that we don't conceal our faces when in public. The gigantic gold statues of idols have never been part of our landscape. We are tolerant and respectful of other religions. If we insist with gentle firmness that the nation's planning rules are to be obeyed, then we can help immigrant communities to build a new wing to our national home rather than a cultural ghetto. And in so doing, they stop feeling like guests and we all benefit from their innovation and vitality.
Okay, so we've thought about your first strand of the hopeful realism strategy, what you've described as the restoration of a civic nation. Let's move on to the second strand of your 3, then. Tell us about that.
The second is to battle in the realm of ideas. Politics is always downstream of culture, and culture is formed by ideas. So it is much more strategic for Christians to engage in intellectual battles rather than political scraps. In this second strand of the hopeful realism strategy, our first job is to stand for truth. Okay? We're to be a prophetic voice telling truth to power. Think of the great prophets of the Old Testament, my heroes, men like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos. They had unswerving integrity, not swayed by the winds of political fashion. They never told politicians what they wanted to hear. Well, that's how we should act. We stand for truth, so we are consistent in criticising all abuses of power and wrongdoing. We don't just own the libs or coddle left and punch right. Christians should never be partisan. Our public discourse should never be a form of propaganda. Like a witness in a courtroom, our only job is to tell the truth. That will require us to denounce perversions against the natural order. I'm obviously thinking here of matters such as abortion, euthanasia, transgenderism and homosexuality. Now, I have obviously set up an apparently unresolvable tension between strands 1 and 2 of the strategy, between trying to negotiate a shared understanding of the common good on the one hand, and on the other denouncing a whole section of society who disagree with the natural law on which the common good is based. Now, we won't resolve that tension until we get to our final strand.
When you talk about this idea of a prophetic voice, some people might envisage a lonely figure in a town centre standing holding a placard. But you're talking about engaging in a battle within the realm of ideas. How might that idea work itself out in practice? What does it actually look like?
So here's a basic principle. Everything bad that happens starts in the university. Every ghastly ideology, every anti-human philosophy begins its life as a conversation between academics. If evangelicals are to make any headway in changing society, we need to start in the academy. As you know, Ollie, I have a great deal of respect for Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who recently became a Christian. She has just launched an initiative called Restoring the West. And in her manifesto she says this: we win elections but lose the culture. We defend policies but surrender the principles. We react to provocations but fail to plant ideas that endure. The West will not be restored by winning news cycles. It will be restored by winning the argument for why the West is worth preserving. And I think that's brilliant. I think she's absolutely right. We need intellectual ammunition. We need clear arguments that address serious objections of clever people who need to be persuaded. Expressing outrage or preaching to the choir will do no good. We need to shape minds, change debates, arm new generations for the work ahead. The way to save the West is to win the battle in the realm of ideas.
Okay, so are you saying then that one of the most important areas of this strategy is concerned with Christian academics? They're the kind of primary focus here, and the rest of us can sort of sit back and relax.
No, I'm not saying that. One of the best ways to win battles in the realm of ideas is to reframe how we preach the gospel. In my experience, evangelicals tend to preach the gospel only in terms of individual conversion. And then separately we get our placards out and protest against violations of the natural law that we see in society. And the problem with that approach is that it makes our protests seem arbitrary. So the unbeliever thinks we disagree with abortion or gay marriage because they go against our traditions or because they violate a set of rules that we live by. And so this brings me to this third principle. We should preach the gospel as a foundation for society. In other words, we preach the entire Christian worldview and show how it answers society's deepest needs. James Davison Hunter says that every culture which has ever existed asks 5 questions. They ask, what is real? How can we know what is real? What is a person? What is good? And what is our goal? For those who like big words, we could describe those 5 questions as ontology, epistemology, anthropology, ethics, and teleology. The Christian worldview has profound and satisfying answers to all 5 of those questions. It explains to our society what is real, how we can know what is real. It explains what a human person is, what is good, and what goal a society should aim for.
And your point is that when we're protesting against abortion or the redefinition of marriage, we shouldn't just present our objections as violations of some Christian rule book. We should show how the Christian worldview has deep and satisfying answers to the big questions that every culture must ask itself.
That's right. So in summary then, the second strand of the hopeful realism strategy is to do battle in the realm of ideas. First and foremost, we must stand for truth in the public square. Second, we need a generation of smart, articulate evangelical academics who can make a persuasive case for preserving Western culture. And finally, We need to reframe the gospel as something that can save society as well as individuals.
A cynic might say that your hopeful realism strategy reduces to ensuring free speech so that a consensus can be built around a shared sense of the common good. At the same time, Christians should engage in battle within academia. But we're still left with the seemingly unresolvable problem, that we can't build consensus with large sections of society who openly pervert the natural law on what you want to base this shared sense of the common good. So while this strategy might be hopeful, it isn't particularly realistic, someone might say. How would you answer that charge?
Yes, I can hear a Christian nationalist dismiss everything I've been saying as pious cant. But we have a final strand to consider, which is much more hard-nosed. And I've called it the cooperate with God strand. And its first principle is to hand our society over to God for judgment. We ask him to let the ruling elite in the West experience the bitter consequences of their own choices. Now, here's where we get to the hard-nosed bit. This strategy means that things will get worse before they get better. Rather than pinning our hopes on one more election victory or one more victory in the Supreme Court, we stop worrying about short-term battles and we think about winning the war. Now, to win the war, we need to change culture. Politics is always downstream of culture. So political victories are usually superficial and ineffective. And if you don't believe me, just think about the Scopes trial of 1925 or the prohibition laws. Now, Christians won those victories, political and legal victories in both cases. But the culture was unmoved. So nothing of any substance changed. If you think in terms of the Bible, it took the exile to change Judah's culture. And it will take a great deal of pain and chaos to change Western culture. But there's no alternative. We must ask God to judge our society, to make it fail fast, so that people will repent of their perversion of the natural law. If you want to understand where a culture is heading, look at its ruling elite. And the elite in the West, in academia, business, media, the legal profession, senior civil servants, the elite has drunk so deeply from the well of neo-Marxism that it will never be changed by politicians. The judgment of God needs to fall on them. We need to get to the point reached by the court officials in Pharaoh's Egypt. You know that moment when they scream at their boss, "Don't you realize Egypt is ruined? This is the finger of God." So that's my first principle in this strand. Hand our society, particularly its ruling elite, over to God for judgment. We should do that formally, without anger, and in full knowledge of the gravity of the request in our church prayer meetings. It is the judgment of God which will bring every section of society back to the table so that we can negotiate a shared understanding of the common good based on natural law.
Okay, so that sounds realistic, but perhaps not all that hopeful, at least in the short term, Jim. Tell us a little bit more about what form you think God's judgment might take then.
Well, you're asking me to engage in idle speculation here, but
you would never dream of doing such a thing.
Well, yeah. Also, I will get to the hope point that you made in a second. I don't know how God will judge the West's ruling elite. We could become engulfed in a global war, or perhaps the arrival of AI will have such a catastrophic effect on society that America might descend into civil war.
That's no. At least you haven't gone sort of fully to the sort of complete catastrophe straight away. I mean, neither of those things sound particularly terrifying, Jim.
Another possibility is that the relentless narrative about toxic masculinity from feminists might open up a real dislike between men and women, so that the birth rate plummets, leading to societal collapse. But the most likely form of judgment will come with the rise of totalitarianism. That's really why I'm so annoyed with the Christian nationalists. I think they are inadvertently accelerating a trend in the West towards authoritarianism. We could be about to see the rise of Nietzsche's Overman. But in whatever form divine judgment comes, it will come. God will not be mocked. A nation reaps what it sows, and the West has deliberately chosen to pervert natural law, so judgment will fall. Our job is to pray that divine judgment will cleanse the West rather than lead to its collapse. We should pray that the ruling elite will be brought quickly to repentance so that we can begin the job of restoring a civic nation. Now, that rather grim point leaves us with two final proposals within this strand of cooperating with God. And the first, you'll be glad to know, Ollie, is to be a source of hope in society. If my Eeyore-like prediction is true, and things get worse before they get better, many young men and women will be tempted to fall into nihilism, to yield to despair or rage. So while divine judgment is falling, the Christian must stand as a beacon of hope. And we can do that, of course, because we know how the story is going to end. We don't need a feel-good factor of dominionist triumphalism to hold on to hope. We can have a quiet confidence that God is in control of this world. And when I was thinking about this whole strategy last night, an image came into my mind. Back in the year 1940, Britain stood alone against the might of Hitler's armies. Dunkirk had been a miracle, but London was being attacked every night in the Blitz. Food was scarce. People were teetering on the edge of despair. And in their air raid shelters, they huddled by those old radio sets with their big central dial, and they listened to a man who gave them hope. Now, I'm not talking about Winston Churchill. I'm thinking of the man called C.S. Lewis. He gave a number of talks about the Christian faith, and the British people listened. They knew that this man with the gentle voice was on their side. He had fought for his country in the Great War. He was patriotic. But he could offer the people more than a shared love of country. He opened their eyes to a stronger hope than nation. We don't need to lash ourselves to political overmen like Donald Trump. We need God to raise up men like C.S. Lewis, men who can give hope to a nation teetering on the edge of despair. We cooperate with God as he executes judgment by being a source of hope. Christian men can face an uncertain future with an optimistic, cheerful humility because we are men of faith. And then just to close, my final point is that we should love our neighbour. They may follow false religions or no religion at all, but they each bear the imago Dei. When Jesus was asked to answer the question, who is my neighbour? He told a story called the Good Samaritan. A man reached out to his neighbour, a man born with a different ethnicity and a different religion, but he helped him just because he was in need. I very much fear that ethno-nationalism will increase terribly in the years ahead, so it is vital that we distinguish between ideas and people. Yes, we battle against false ideologies and false religions in the realm of ideas, but we can still love our neighbours. We can still show care for the men and women who have joined us from other countries. We can help them build their own extension to our national home so that they don't feel like permanent guests. One of the things I love about my church is that it is packed full of international students, young men and women from all over the world. It is a precious thing. So never lose the horror of ethno-nationalism. Love your neighbour as yourself.
So your hopeful realism strategy has three strands: restore a civic nation, do battle in the realm of ideas, and cooperate with God by being a source of hope while he uses judgment to bring our ruling elite to repentance. If this strategy is to work, then we need Christian men who will lead it. And that brings us back to the title for this season, Men of the West. In our first episode, we said that we would deal with two intertwined crises, the crisis of Western civilization and the crisis over masculinity. So as we draw this season to a close, Jim, let's finish by setting out the vision for masculinity, which the hopeful realism strategy needs.
Yeah, we should just clarify here that we aren't trying to give some generic vision of masculinity here. We're thinking about the specific type of men needed for this cultural moment.
Okay. So in episode 4, we talked about the challenges which young, in particular white Christian men face. Many are lonely. They are blamed, seemingly, for everything that is wrong in the world, or at least they feel that way. They also feel dishonored. And as we've seen, a good number of these men have been drawn into the dark pagan world of the manosphere, which, as we've seen, is a truly disturbing space. And in that world, they're encouraged to join digital tribes that are misogynistic and anti-Semitic. This is the world of Andrew Tate, Clavicular, and Nick Fuentes. It's the nihilistic world of incels, a space full of despair and rage. And it is sad that some forms of Christian nationalism lead men into this world.
I suggest we close by discussing 5 characteristics that the young Christian men listening to us now should seek to develop within themselves. The 5 qualities I'm going to mention are the hallmarks of a man of faith. One of my criticisms of Christian nationalism is that as a project, it rarely mentions the need for faith. That's because the turn to politics reveals an inner secularism within evangelicalism. Christian nationalism could run very well as a secular project, but we need men of faith.
And so faith is the first hallmark that you identify. A man of faith steps into the unknown to bring order to the world. It takes courage to overcome the instinct to shrink back. But the man of faith can take responsibility for things he cannot necessarily control because he trusts in God. Christian nationalism is a project designed to achieve control in society. But the strategy you've outlined, Jim, allows men to take responsibility for things that they don't control.
And the only way you can square that circle of taking responsibility without control is through faith. It's only by faith that we can take responsibility for that which we do not control.
And perhaps a good example of this quality is Joshua in the Old Testament. At the start of the book of Joshua, he's lost his father figure. Moses has died, leaving his young protege in charge of a nation that stood on the edge of the promised land. And it was unknown territory, and Joshua must have felt an enormous weight of responsibility on his shoulders because there was no clear and obvious blueprint for him to follow. And he had real decisions to make that could go horribly wrong. And in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9, the Lord says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." If we're going to step out into the public square, not being quite sure what will meet us there, we'll have no one to hide behind, no powerful figure to make us feel safe. But men of faith still step out into the unknown to bring order to the world because they trust the promise that God will go with them.
Yes, Jordan Peterson was right when he said that responsibility is what gives life meaning. But Christian nationalism goes wrong because it insists on getting control before taking responsibility. A second hallmark of a man of faith is that he uses truth rather than power. If I had to select one moment in Scripture which destroys the theology of Christian nationalism, it is the scene recorded in John chapter 19. Pontius Pilate sits in his judgment seat. Before him stands a bloodied figure wearing a crown of thorns. He stands in silent nobility before human government and explains that his kingdom is not of this world, otherwise his servants would fight. He says, "Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" sneers Pilate, because like all politicians, he reduced everything to power. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" This is the confrontation between truth and power. And in the end, truth wins. Followers of Jesus Christ are called to use truth and not power in their confrontation with the world. Now, I'm not being mean when I say this, that lurking behind Christian nationalism is the idolatry of power. And men of faith should step away from that idol and stand for truth.
A third characteristic you've identified in a man of faith, Jim, is that he never gives in to nihilistic despair. So think of Joseph in Genesis. He had a hard life as a young man full of setbacks and hard knocks. But Joseph showed resilience and optimism in whatever circumstances he found himself in. When he was sold into slavery, he ran Potiphar's household. When he was thrown into prison, he ended up running the prison. And when he was eventually made prime minister by Pharaoh, he ran the whole country. And one of the most worrying features of the manosphere is its nihilism. For incels, there is nothing left but rage and despair. But men who have faith in God have all the spiritual resources necessary to have resilience, even when life seems unfair and unpleasant.
When we were talking about the sort of masculine qualities that this cultural moment needs, I thought over everything we've said this season and realised there's a deceptively simple quality that's needed. Men of faith treat women with respect. There's no better example of this quality than our Lord himself. Just read through John's Gospel and see the sensitivity to women, his instinct to protect them. He respected their intelligence and their spiritual understanding. How different that attitude is to the wicked perspectives we see today. Womanhood is being attacked in our culture from every direction. The feminism of the progressive left is anti-female. Feminists sneer at marriage and motherhood, and by rejecting any form of biological essentialism, they have paved the way for transgenderism. And then there's Islam. Islam is guilty of terrible misogyny. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, was killed this week. He said that women facing execution should be raped before they were killed to make sure that they didn't go to paradise. Imams commonly teach that women are animals given to men for their benefit. And then More recently, women have been attacked from the woke right, from the manosphere leaders like Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes. So a key characteristic of men of faith in this moment is that they treat women with respect.
And then the final quality you've identified as being that of a man of faith is that he protects, nourishes, and develops those he loves. The Gospel records many instances in which the immediate instinct of the Lord Jesus is to protect those he loves. For those of us who are called to be fathers, this quality is essential. We may have to build Christian households in a culture that is chaotic. If things do get worse before they get better, then there is perhaps no more important role than for a young man to get married and, if God permits, to raise children together with his wife. God may, of course, have a different calling for some, but the normal course of life means that being a husband and a father is something to which young men should aspire.
So hopefully those 5 qualities are ideas that young men listening to us now can think about for themselves. Men of faith take responsibility for things they cannot control. They use truth rather than power. They never give in to nihilistic despair. They treat women with respect, and they protect, nourish, and develop those that they love. Now, just before we draw this season to a close, Ollie, I want to say a quick word to any church leaders or youth leaders who may be listening. I made the point in episode 4 that the root problem with young Christian men today is father hunger. They live in a culture which has diminished the father figure to a bumbling fool. And yet young men need father figures to develop their masculine spirit. If you remember, I went down a rabbit hole in that episode talking about mythology and Jungian archetypes. But I made the point that in mythology, the father is this luminous Arthurian figure who brings down light from the sun into family life. The son perceives the father as bright. He seeks to emulate his father, to become as bright as he is, to reach his height. And I think there's something in that idea, you know. So here's my point. We need father figures in our churches who can mentor young men and help them develop their identity. As we have said repeatedly in this series, young men are building their identity online at the moment by joining digital tribes. The manipulative algorithms that drive social media are introducing them to destructive, downright evil concepts of masculinity. So somehow we need to move identity formation offline and back into the real world of church and family.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, healthy identities, well, they can only be formed in the real world.
That's right. And so that's a conversation church leaders need to have together over the coming months. Now, Ollie, there is really only one way to finish this season. I finish by addressing the young men listening to us now with these words. You'll recognize them. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship, but it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men come crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West.